in some of the educations. I wanted to make sure that you have a chance to read the disclosure before I go on to talk about South-South cooperation and technology transfer from developing countries to African countries. Now, in the 1960s and 1970s, you have a situation where nearly the entire continent was mobilized against colonial rule. So at the time, the struggle between African countries and the colonial powers was as clear as black and white. Over the years in the 1960s and 1970s, things have changed slightly. I'm going to keep going on giving you a little bit of historical background so that you can have a very broad perception, understanding of where we were in the 1950s and 1960s, and then where we are now today with African countries, the ability to transform their economies, transform their societies through technology transfer, hopefully from South to other South countries. And so the South is as broad as Western Europe. We have terminologies in political science, South and North, that basically suggests the economic classifications around the world. But the South, you have to understand that it is as diverse as Western European countries. So when I'm making generalization, I hope you understand that there are diversities within the South. So having given you just a little bit of background information about the political history, the economic challenges of African countries, then I'm going to move on to an increasing engagement between emerging economies, particularly China, with African economies, and the possibility, the opportunities for African countries to adapt and hopefully emulate the Chinese experience in Africa, and then take you to where we are today in terms of technological adaptation and economic growth. So as I indicated at the beginning of my speech, in the 1950s and 1960s, there were great expectations by the people. The expectations were better access for education, health, infrastructure, human rights, political freedom, civil liberties, and so on. But then you have individuals who actually fought for the right to freedom of expression, the right to independence, for political freedom, for human rights. You have leaders emerging from all across the African continent who wish to stay in power, and just recently we have a situation where one of our leaders in North Africa who is very seriously ill but wanted to stay in power. And that's just one case. So you have so many different African countries, leaders emerging into power and having a firm grip for the 1960s and 1970s. And one of the obsession about African leaders was that they were going to be exerting serious pressure on the public, on the people, so that they can have full control over the state. The state, you know, has all the resources, the economic, the political, the social, the media, all the resources are at its disposal. So they wanted to maintain a strong control over the state. And here are a number of examples by which the African leaders were trying to have a firm grip on the state. In Nigeria, for example, you have in 1972, 40% of the expenditures were or military hardware, or salaries and services and wages for the military. You also have Chad and Rwanda. In Ethiopia is one of the countries with the largest number of armed forces in the history of the continent. And that requires a huge expenditure on the public treasury. At the same time, while they were spending billions of dollars on purchasing means of destruction as opposed to means of construction and building the state, they were spending excessively on equipping themselves with machine guns and tanks and bombs and so on. And only a few countries were really committed to delivering the service required by the public. And one of the examples was Burkina Faso. In the 1960s, 70s, China, and not a lot of people talk about Cuba. Cuba was one of the countries that actually fought for independence side by side with the peoples of Africa. But in any event, China was one of the countries that stood in the fight against colonial rule. But at the time, China was not really a very big power. They were actually importing arms from Western countries and Russia. They have their own issues with the communist government of China, and the communist government of Russia had their own ideological battles. But the Chinese are claiming to take credit for liberating parts of the African continent. To add to the dilemmas and the challenges of African development, you have from the mid-1950s all the way to 1989, the struggle for the control of the entire world between the two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. At the time, the demand for weapons was almost universal. When the African countries demanded or requested beams as opposed to guns, many of them have gotten some beams, but a lot of guns. You know, the terminology beam refers to the infrastructure for development, the bridge between society, the bridge between economies. While Western countries were providing capitalist ideology without capital, so did the socialist countries were offering African countries socialist ideology of development without capital. And here you have a situation from the 1995 all the way to 2013, and if you go back all the way back to the 1960s, probably in the 1960s, the situation in Africa was slightly better than it was in the 1970s and 1980s. The GDP per capita for developing economies, Latin America and Caribbean, East Asia and Pacific, Sub-Saharan Africa was the lowest. And even today, you have 33 of the 46 least developing countries are in Africa. Now imagine that. After all these investments, foreign aid, after all the abundant natural resources that anywhere in Africa that one would be able to find, you have a situation where GDP has not really moved slightly. "33 of the 46 in the world are in Africa. Why? Well, one of them is you have bureaucratic inefficiencies, brain drain. We talked about it. The ambassador from the minister from Bahama talked about brain drain. In African countries, if they were going to be able to develop their economies, if they are going to be offering incentives for foreign investors to come in and stay and invest, they should also do the same thing for their own people, providing them the incentives to stay. You have push factors and pull factors. There are push factors from within and pull factors from without. And Europeans who used to offer incentives for the well-educated, skilled African labor force to migrate to Western Europe, Germany, Great Britain, France, and you name it. And corruption? His Excellency from Nigeria has also talked about corruption. Corruption is one of the crises that faces African countries. And a crisis for me is like a cancer. Cancer actually eats up the cell that helps the cancer to survive. And corruption is similar to that. Exhausting all the resources from within each one of the African countries, thereby denying any kind of opportunities for ordinary people to make meaningful changes to their own lives and to their own families. Now, I have been struggling with the second last point there, investment risk and returns. You know, in economies, my master's degree is in international business and economics. So as far as I know, if the risks are great, the returns are great too. And if you assume that investment in Africa is riskier, then obviously the profit is higher too. And if the business bottom line is making profits, the higher the better, then why shouldn't foreign investors invest in Africa? Because the risks are high. The returns should also be higher too. Well, there are a host of explanations. One of them is really image matters. Then the image of Africa until very recently has not been very good. And it has to do with the media. It has to do with misperception, misinformation. And I happen to be so lucky to have come back to Ethiopia at a time where we had one of the smoothest power transfer in the history of the country. In April 2, 2018, we had a military government for 17 years in Ethiopia, followed by a tyrannical regime that hails its roots from one of the minority groups in Ethiopia, who ruled the country with iron fist for 27 years. Then you have almost like a miracle. April 2, 2018, a smooth constitutional transition of power. But these stories are not really magnified in international media. I don't know how many of you heard about the transition. Maybe because you are in one of the best institutes, you probably did some research. Nigeria is one of the largest and leading economies in Africa. You have Zambia. Zimbabwe is yet another example where you have a military rule for as long as the country's independence. And you have a smooth transition of power in Zimbabwe, and nobody expected that to happen. And misperception or perception sometimes influences your expectation, if not always. The human capital, the natural resources, the climate for tourism, the business climate for investment. And capital has been so hard to come by for African countries. And the fact is, If you can think of any kind of natural resources anywhere in the world, you will find it in Africa. None of us would be able to use our mobile devices if it was not for the Congo. Because Congo has an abundance of resources that makes the mobile phone and the laptop work nicely. And yet, Africa, as I have shown you earlier, is the slowest. Many of the African countries, in terms of growth, many of the African countries that are poor, 33 is not a simple number. It's huge. In those 33, Ethiopia is one of them with 103 million people. So the dilemma for many of the African countries was, here we have resources, but the resources are not, we are not able to exploit the resources because the kind of resources that we have require capital, investment in capital. And capital is very hard to come by for African countries for a number of reasons which I have already mentioned. So the recommendation by the financial institutions, international financial institutions, namely the World Bank and the IMF, is African countries have comparative advantage in the extraction of natural resources. That's a very simple, straightforward theory. But they are not able to exploit those resources, so the capital has to come from capital-rich countries. Now, you may be wondering why in the world a government allows and provides incentive for other investors to come in, extract your resources, exploit your resources. On top of that, you have to provide incentives, tax holidays. But to attract, you have to provide incentives. You have to make reforms, macroeconomic reforms, so that investors will be welcomed and invest in your economy. If you are willing to have some access to their own natural resources and be able to generate hard currency for which you are going to be spending it on purchasing sometimes luxury products, you know, BMWs and Range Rovers and so on, for the ministers. I hope I am forgiven. Because I'm simply speaking as an academician, not a diplomat. I'm not a diplomat. But that's really one of the challenges. And corruption, you know, the issue of corruption has been so big among African policy makers. The African Union has actually recognized the entire year in the fight against corruption. Nigeria is one of the leaders in terms of fighting against corruption, demanding the resources to be returned back to the continent. Now, this is somewhat interesting. In the 1970s and 1980s, right up to the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had about 3 dozens of preconditions for loan. Beginning in the 1980s, there is a very good reason why that is so. Beginning in the 1980s, in the 1990s, you have requirements, preconditions for political liberalization, which I'm very fine with it. Who wouldn't want to live in a free society, in a democracy? But the conditions were really a long list of laundry items that African countries would have to meet to attract foreign capital. There is also some, you know, obsession about domestic determinants of foreign direct investment. Why? Because our recent experience tells us that home countries, host countries, don't really have to do much about, you know, reforming their macroeconomic systems in order to attract foreign investors. The Chinese came in. The Indians are in, Brazil is in, Russia is in. Why? Because there is a demand for natural resources, energy sources for the growing economies of the East Asian countries or Asian countries. So I'm not quite sure why we need to be so obsessed about reforming our domestic environment so that we'll be able to attract. There are some areas, of course, we need to do some better jobs. But as a requirement for foreign investment, it really makes very little sense to me. The Beijing Consensus. And it's not a coincidence that we have terminologies like Beijing Consensus. That's just basically to counter the Washington Consensus. The Beijing Consensus is, one of them is, you see, you realize that, now this is a misperception, it's not true. But the general understanding is China and the African countries have a very long history. And China is a third world country. So third world country leaders can better understand other third world leaders too. That's one of them. The other one is China and African countries can actually chart a common path of development. Non-interference, as opposed to offering a list of conditions for investment and development loans. And the claim is China is in the business of the business of China is business, not really politics. Development loans without preconditions, and there is, as you can imagine, there is a reason why I have some of them are under quotation marks and question marks. Resource-backed loans, infrastructure, real estate, power, development, and so on. The resource-backed loan is really an experience of Chinese own experience with Japan. In 1978, Japan needed energy sources, and the best way to get it is next door neighbor, China. So they have provided the capital for Chinese to extract and industrialize. In return, China was to offer raw material. And the same rule seems to apply for the relationship between China and the African countries too. Not quite exactly the same, but that's how it's been taken. Now, why did I say not exactly the same? Because the Japanese didn't go to China to build China's infrastructure. The relationship between China and the African countries is that China was going to offer the capital in return to raw material, but the Chinese are going to be building the infrastructure, real estate, roads, and highways, and dams, and so on. So you can't really transpose one-to-one relationship between how the Chinese experience applies to the African countries. But the assumption is, if China can rise, so can African countries. Now, this is, I have quite a list of graphs, and I can just skip because I don't want to bore you with graphs. But as you can see, much of the significant exports from Africa to many of the major trading partners are fuel and mining products. And that has been since, I think the data says 2000 all the way to 2013. So the focus is really the extraction of raw material, the extraction of fuel and energy supplies to the external market. And here is to China, and that one is to India. Agricultural products and manufacturing are very low. The same thing to India. The European Union, the same story. Africa's export to the United States, the same story. You see there is a dip somewhere in 2008 and 2009. That's basically a reflection of the 2008 recession. And that happens for United States and European Union. The only difference I say is for European Union, while it grew slightly, improved slightly better from 2009 to 2012. For the United States, trade and export between Africa's export to the United States has been in decline. Africa's major exports to South Africa, the same thing. You see the trend? You see the pattern? In 2012 isn't that far, just about seven years ago. Okay, so this is, I think for many of us would be a little bit more interesting than the information that I have given you, because I think it's generally known that African countries are exporting fuel and raw material and mining products to the rest of the world. What I wanted to say is there isn't really a clear understanding about what technology is. Technology isn't just this. Technology is not just this. It's a combination of science, and science is about experimentation, theory, knowing, exploring. Technology includes knowledge, the arts, the skills, the experiences. So a combination of the science and the theory gives you a product what's known as technology. It's a technical knowledge. So everything that you have here is really a hardware. But in it, even the design requires some arts. The lighting, the color, the functionality or dysfunctionality, all of these involve skills and artists and science and experimentations and theorizing, and all of these are combined all together are what technology is about. It isn't just a smartphone. A smartphone is just a collectivity of technologies. It's generally a product of research and development. Research is about theorizing, investigating, and exploring. Development is producing something. And in there is also a requirement for compatibility of language. If I am going to be adapting some foreign language or some foreign technology to my own needs, I have to be able to understand the story behind it, how to make it, how to modify it, so how to imitate it, and so on and so on. And all of that requires actually, a free thinking mind. A free thinking mind cannot be enjoyed if one is living under authoritarian system. Language, property rights protection, freedom of thought. Now, of course, given all of this, you have a system, a conduit by which technology is going to be transmitted. through diffusion, adaptation, imitation, modification, and so on and so on. And the end result would be, the expected result would be productivity, competitiveness in the world economy, a rise in income, and in well-being. I don't have to go to a doctor to get checked up, every 6 months. So I can just Google my information and say, I need to go to the department store next door and buy maybe aspirin or Tylenol or something like that, Now, not everything can be transferred. Why? Because there is national security, economic, and political rationale behind it. I think governments would be stupid enough to transfer the entire technology from one country to another. And here are the utility model applications by applicants' origin. The leader is China, and here we have Japan is just following China. The numbers here are staggering. From 1980 all the way to 2017. A group of countries, Uruguay, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and all of these are really hidden under the horizontal line, near to the horizontal line. That means they're not really thinking about inventing or being able to invent. And there are economic reasons behind it. The application process is one. Even if people are creating something, to apply and get a patent and a permit and protection rights to one's invention takes a very long time. Usually it's about six months, but it all depends on who's submitting the applications. The cost of it is a challenge. And many of the African countries may be creative enough to develop something that society may be able to use. But the challenge here again is, internet access is not reliable, and much of the application nowadays has been online, and so that's one additional barrier. This is for about 45, 46 countries. And the only visible signs of progress in terms of utility model design is Kenya and Ethiopia. Seychelles is another one. Industrial design applications by country, again, China. If I were able to delete the trend line for China, you would have a rising up of the number of applications for the other countries that I have here. Russian Federation, Portugal, Brazil, Netherlands, and United Kingdom, and so on and so on. But because the Chinese design applications have been so dominant, the rest of them becomes almost invisible. Now, how about the actual product that African countries are exporting to the rest of the world? Are they composed of any kind of skills and technologies embedded in the products? And here you have a graph that shows the primary commodities, precious and steel products are the major exports. And everything else, the miscellaneous manufactured articles, low skill and technology manufacturing, high skill, almost invisible for a majority of the African countries. Okay? Okay, so now I have talked about the misperceptions and misconceptions about how we would be able to emulate the Chinese experience into Africa. The problem is resource-backed loans from Japan and foreign direct investment from developed economies to China. It isn't from developing countries to another developing country. The Chinese have been able to build their economies, having absorbed much of the investment capital coming from developed economies, not developing countries. Another one is, I don't know if people talk about it, but there is a difference between multinational corporations and state-owned enterprises. And many of the investors coming into Africa, particularly from China, are state-owned enterprises. They're not private, they're state-owned enterprises. With all the information, the capital, the network, and all of these are going to be adding up and making it a lot easier for Chinese investors to invest in Africa, as opposed to, a private investor coming into one of the African markets and finding its own way. Special economic zones. Now, when Western countries went to China, they were not investing willy-nilly wherever they wanted. The Chinese government was directing where to invest, what to invest. The requirements, the capital and the labor requirements, the employment requirements were all laid out. That's not similar with African countries. Maybe the African countries are in desperate need of capital. But so were China. Market access. Now, earlier we were talking about disposable income. I'm not so sure if many of us have disposable income. For the majority of the peoples of Africa, there's no such thing as disposable income. I think disposable income is something left over, maybe from savings and basic expenditures and going to the Bahamas and the Caribbean for a couple of weeks vacation. Now, when Western European countries, or Germany, the Netherlands, and Great Britain, and United States, and so on, Canada, went to China, they were looking for cheap labor so that they would be able to raise their profit margins. Now, imagine a country with 1.3 billion people investing in any part of the African continent, looking for cheap labor. It cannot happen because labor in China is cheap. It's so cheap that at one point when I was traveling back to the United States, all of a sudden, Bonn International Airport, many of them probably travel through it, the entire terminal was flooded, I'm sorry to say, with people from. So they're actually bringing in their own labor force, thereby diminishing the values and the ability and opportunity of the African people to find gainful employment. About 60% of the African population, east, south, north, west, central, are between the ages of 15 and 35. For some of the countries, the unemployment rate is about 40%. The dependence and the working age population is really have seen quite an imbalance. You also have grandmothers raising their grandchildren. The 1980s and all the way to the 1990s. Many of the countries were affected by the AIDS virus. And so grandchildren are being raised by grandparents. You also have an age gap between the two. And here are a few suggestions and recommendations. One of them is creating strong backward and forward linkages or value chain. We have had very good discussion about how agriculture can actually be one of the foundations for expanding a country's economy, in this case Nigeria. And I suspect that it is also the same for many of the African countries. And I think one of the major challenges for African countries is there is really no value chain or backward and forward linkages in the extractive sector. It's all capital intensive. People who are earning a living from working in the mines, they probably go to restaurants and department stores to purchase a few items here and there, and much of their time is really spent on underground. Almost. But you could have quoted. Transparency and accountability. And I said earlier, at the beginning of my discussion, if African countries were going to be making it favorable for foreign investors to come in, I think they should also make it much more favorable to their own citizens to stay. And sometimes it's really tiring and bothering to see, African migrants stranded on the Mediterranean Sea. And yesterday I was sitting right there on the corner. When I saw the rise of Africa, I almost felt like crying. Because that was the only time that I have seen something like that. And I thank you very much, Professor Mark. Thank you. Thank you. Now, don't ask a very hard question now.
Thank you very much. And please, the floor is yours for questions or for comments. And hopefully we can make this as interactive as possible. So, who would like to go first? Yes, please.
My name is Emmanuel. Thank you for the presentation. Earlier on, you did mention about one of the issues of Africa. You're talking about risk-reward. And you mentioned that if it is risky to invest in Africa, then there's a possibility that there will be so much reward. And for a business, you'll be interested in profits. So why wouldn't you still go there? Then you did mention image as one of the factors that investors wouldn't want to come to Africa. But then the question that I asked is, who is supposed to take charge of the image of countries? If somebody blindfolds you and takes you to South Africa, drops you at Cape Town and takes off the phone, you'll think that you are in Europe. But for me in Ghana, the only news that I used to hear about South Africa is Africans banning Africans or beating Africans. In that sense, even me in Ghana, I wouldn't want to go to South Africa. But aside that, it is a beautiful country, just like Europe. Who is projecting that aspect of South Africa to people? Somebody is supposed to be in charge. Because obviously, we are also here, down here, and we get to know about school shootings in US. But that has not stopped people from sending their children to US to school. Because the US has projected an image that is bigger than their problems. And we all have various countries that have issues, problems here and there, but then people have taken charge, because the same CNN that will report about the school shootings would also report about something positive about the US. The media is just a platform. Everybody has the opportunity to harness it to the advantage. Is that right?
Yes.
If South Africans are agitating against other Africans, same South Africans can still project the beauty of Cape Town, of all other cities, just like Europe. So now I feel that countries are now being run on business models. Because if it wasn't, then Rwanda wouldn't put their country tag on the jersey of Arsenal. So that when Arsenal is playing in the UK, and you sit in front of your television and you watch, you get to know that there's a country called Rwanda. They've had a very difficult and challenging past. But the country, the government has placed upon themselves to project the positives of that country. It doesn't mean that there are not investor challenges in Rwanda. Is that right? So the question that I'm asking you is that, who are those who are supposed to be in charge of the images of countries? Is it the citizens of the country, or is it the governments of the country? Is that right? Because when His Excellency was talking about, from Nigeria, was talking about the investor things that they have put in place. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Does it also come with an image of Nigeria? How is Nigeria being advertised? Because to me, I have a lot of Nigerian friends. Wherever you see a Nigerian, you see a Ghanaian. It's like we are twins, we move together. Is that right? So the question is that, who is in charge of the images of countries? Because the ambassador of Pakistan, when he was here yesterday, people were trying to stow hammer on the challenges of the Taliban and the routes with India, but he also kept on projecting the positives of Pakistan. Is that right? So then we ask ourselves that, who is in charge of the images of countries? Because all of us have challenges. That is
Sure.
great.
Sure.
Then the second, let me quickly, so that you address the two. You talked about the reason why US, Canada, countries in Europe would go to China is because there's cheap labor. But I can also say that there's cheaper labor in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that there's skills mismatch. If ExxonMobil is coming to Ghana because there's oil discovery, there are no technicians in that industry in Ghana. But if a country decides to invest in China, though the labor is cheap, they will still get the skills. So the reason why they are not coming down here is not because labor is expensive comparatively, but then I can say that labor in Africa will be cheaper because most of the multinationals, assuming Barclays, the wages they pay in UK is not the same that they pay in Barclays, Ghana. It's cheaper. But the challenge is that you may not get the skill requirement that you are looking out for. That is why in most of the African countries, you'll have multinationals coming down with expatriates. What happens to the nationals? So it means that there's an actual problem that we are supposed to be looking at. So these are all projection indicators that let us know the actual situation. But then you can see that there's an underlying problem that ought to be tackled. Right, thank you.
Sure. I was fortunate enough to spend a semester at Wits University in Johannesburg. When I arrived there, the department chair wanted to make sure that he provides me with all accommodation. So I was taken to his house to stay for the entire semester. And the minute I walked in, the department chair's house was barbed, wired, fenced, and when you go in, you have to go in by clicking some kind of, codes to go in and go outside, and you have wires all around the house and pool and everything else. And I said, get me out of here. Why? Because for some of the people who had a negative impression of South Africa, it would have been much more comfortable to stay there. But for me, if I go out and expose myself to some danger, then let it be. Because that's how I was supposed to be learning, understanding, meeting the people, sharing their experiences and feeling their pain. Now, that's not going to change anything about the image of South Africa. But the image change has to come from all of us, the leaders, and individuals. I think people somehow become complacent about, ordinary people have become complacent about their situation. They give our leaders a very long period of time to adjust themselves and to make themselves comfortable in the palace. 20 plus years later, we say we have enough of it. We have enough of it. We rise up, North Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, you name it. I think the people generally has to take responsibility for the management of their own country. And we shouldn't allow our leaders to treat the state as if it was their own private property. You know the famous quote by the former Zaire president? A journalist asked him, who is the state? And Mobutu says, I am the state. When a journalist asked the former Zimbabwe president whether it's time for him to say farewell to the people, and he said, where are they going? They're not going anywhere. You see? So, and up to a point, I think I felt maybe leaders don't really change a lot in terms of the situation in a country. But I have seen it right in the middle of it. I have seen a person by the name of Abiy Mohammed, Prime Minister Abiy Mohammed of Ethiopia. He has been doing a very fantastic job, almost single-handedly. And of course, that has to be backed up by mass demonstrations for more than 3 years. Capital city, northwestern part of the country, the people have had enough of it. But then the right person at the right moment stepped in. I mean, it could have turned out, much worse than this. But fortunately, it didn't. And I think maybe some luck is also required too. I hope I answered your question.
Three more questions. Four, because we're running a little time, but try to keep it brief, and we'll see if we can get them on.
Actually, for me, it's not really a question, Professor. It's just a little addition. I just tend to get a feeling that sometimes we hit ourselves as Africans a little bit too much. I would like to point out that there is more democratic elections in Africa today and less coups than there used to be before. I would also like to point out that there is term limits to presidents and politicians now more than there is even in Europe. Ms. Angela Merkel has been around for 4 terms. Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu will be trying to go in for a 5th term. Yeah. Where I come from in Zambia, you cannot go beyond 2 terms. I would like to point out, like my colleague did point out earlier here, that there is more stringent laws to fight graft or grift or corruption than there has ever been before in Africa. So I beseech you to change a little bit of your tone on how we are so bad, because we are not that bad. There is a lot of more good coming out of Africa than there used to be in the past. Like my brother was pointing out there, that is the image that is portrayed mostly by those that control the media, the narrative, the Western media, the CNN, the BBC. But there's a lot of good things that are coming out now than before. It's just a pity and unfortunate that I'm from a media background, and they say if it bleeds, it leads. So the bad story tends to sell a little bit much more than the good story. So my brother and I, we try to tell the good story, right?
Well, thank you for the comment, if I can say just a word. I have already apologized for speaking as an academician, and so I hope I'm forgiven.
It's a free country. Okay. So thank you very much to the Ambassador of Zambia, and welcome as well. We're very happy to have you with us. We're looking forward to the Zambia events shortly. Ambassador of Nigeria, maybe?
Yeah, mine is just a comment. Thank you very much, Professor, for that elucidating presentation. I just wanted to point out that the statistics that were on the slide about military expenditure, I think it was, Nigeria, 1972 or something.
Yeah, yeah.
5.3% of the GDP.
I think it's more than that, yeah. Okay.
Something like that.
Mhm.
5.3%.
Okay.
We had a civil war, 1967 to 1970. So we were actually demobilizing at the time. As a matter of fact, there's even a higher percentage of military spending to GDP. In 1969, it was 10%. So it's like, you know, going through the American Civil War, and, you know, so it wasn't a military dictatorship. Therefore, they were just taking or spending more on military. There was the raison d'etre for that military expenditure was the Civil War. We had to keep the country together. And then something interesting you said was about, I think, design applications, which I found quite interesting because this underscores the reason why you find countries like Nigeria sometimes slow in committing certain economic agreements. Case in point, EU, EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement, ECOWAS, because you find that the 20th century agreements, you're not talking about design applications, patenting, copyright laws, it's not factored in. So we're keener on 21st century agreements that are more in line with the sort of free trade agreements and, you know, the anachronistic or atavistic 20th century agreement. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
I would like to talk about the image issue about Africa. Give an example from myself. I'm from Benin Republic. I'm a university professor. I remember I got a job in Nigeria and my wife told me not to go. Because when you go to Nigeria, they will kill you. You see, so there are so bad news that have been portrayed in years back, even now, that is making Africa to be looked at as a dangerous place. But I have come from Africa. I went to school in the US. I was the first, the top in my education. The top among all the Africans, among all the Europeans and the US students. And yet I came from Africa. And I'm from Africa now, studying this country. English is not my language, but I'm speaking English. I can also speak French. And I am an African. So there are good things from Africa. We got Africans, General Secretary of the United Nations. So Africa is a good continent. So we have to start saying it now. And as I was saying during my presentation this morning, we have to start from the grassroots, changing the mentality of our students from the primary to the university. Now at the institutional level in the African Union, in all the institutions in Africa, we have to redefine our identity. We have to tell ourselves the truth and rewrite our history and have a good image of Africa. Like the ambassador for Pakistan yesterday, everybody was pointing out of the security issues of Pakistan, but he was just talking about Pakistan. Pakistan is a good country. Pakistan, you see, and you forget that the way he was presenting it, you will forget that there is gun in Pakistan. You just think like you are in heaven. And yet Pakistan is good. So we have to change the way we view our countries. Nigeria is a good country. South Africa is a good country. All countries in Africa are very good.
Okay, good. Now, if I can say just a word, there may be a cultural differences between countries in Asia and countries in Africa. I think, if I can be just biased, we tend to be honest, committed to our faiths and religion, and there is no hiding anything. So you don't just dress up some of the issues that we have in Africa for creating an image, which is fine. But the genuineness and the honesty is one of our cultural attributes. If there are some good things about Africa, then we should say it. If there are some bad things about any part of the continent, we should also point it out. But the discussion has to be, to a large extent amongst our, communities. And we should be able to sort out those problems. And there are, Kofi Annan, for example, was one of the prominent leaders in the effort to change the image of her. He was one of the earliest person who recognized that the image of Africa is really painted, glossed over, as if it was back in the 1800s, 1700s, while the reality is much more different than we have it in the medias. So image definitely is one of the areas in which, probably one of the main areas that we need to work. I think that kind of image, if I can add one more point here, there is an image as beautiful, as crystal clear in some parts outside of the continent of Africa. And everybody wanted to go there, in the promised land. And some of us are actually convinced that the streets were paved with gold. We went there, it wasn't. So here, that's really about image. So we probably have to work very hard in changing the image of Africa. And the decency of the people is really amazing. Everywhere I go, I drop my luggage, Kenya, Mali, Senegal, in some of the countries, and Tanzania, South Africa. I started telling you the story earlier, and instead of staying in a secluded area, very well protected area, I decided to go outside and live with the people because I know my own people. But that kind of feelings and decency has to be promoted worldwide. Okay? Any more questions? Sure. I agree. Sure.
Okay, well, I think we do need to conclude. We're a little bit over schedule, but thank you very, very much for the presentation, the excellent discussion that followed. Let's all please show our gratitude for the excellent.
Thank you. Thank you.